The boy who arrived in London on the morning of June the 14th, 1346, was not prepared for what he found. His name was Edmund Thorne, and he was 17 years old, tall for his age, with the lean frame of someone who had spent his childhood hauling wool bales in the countryside of Kent. His father, William Thorne, was a moderately successful wool merchant who had spent 2 decades trading fleece with Flemish buyers and saving every spare coin for one purpose: to send his eldest son to London, where real fortunes were made. Edmund had been raised on stories of the capital. His father spoke of it the way a priest speaks of heaven, with reverence and longing and an unshakable belief that everything good waited there. London was where a boy became a man. London was where a family name could be transformed from ordinary to extraordinary. London was the future. And so, on a warm June morning, Edmund walked the final stretch of road toward the city gates with a leather satchel over his shoulder, a letter of introduction in his pocket, and a heart full of expectation. He could see the spires of churches rising above the walls. He could hear the distant hum of thousands of voices, of commerce and conversation, of life happening at a scale he had never experienced. He quickened his pace. And then the smell hit him. It came in waves, each one worse than the last, as if the city were exhaling directly into his face. The first wave was sour, like milk left in the sun for days. The second was sharper, metallic and thick, the unmistakable tang of waste, both animal and human. The third wave was the worst. It was not a single smell, but a combination so dense and layered that Edmund's stomach revolted before his mind could even categorize what he was breathing. He stopped walking. He bent over and pressed both hands against his knees, gasping, fighting the urge to empty his stomach right there on the road. A passing carter, a grizzled man with a cart full of timber, looked at him and laughed without slowing down. "First time, eh? You will learn to breathe through your mouth, boy. Or you will leave. Makes no difference to London either way." Edmund straightened up, pulled his shirt collar over his nose, and forced himself forward. He had not walked 60 miles to turn back because of a bad smell. He did not yet understand that this was not a bad smell. This was London itself. This was the smell of 200,000 people living on top of each other in a city with no sewers, no waste collection, no running water in most homes, and no concept of sanitation as anything more than a word the priests occasionally used in sermons about spiritual cleanliness. The streets Edmund walked through were not paved in any meaningful sense. Some of the main thoroughfares had stones laid down, but most roads were packed earth that turned to mud with the slightest rain and baked into cracked, uneven surfaces in the summer heat. And on every street, in every lane and alley, there was waste. Kitchen scraps thrown from upper windows, chamber pots emptied into gutters that ran down the center of the road, animal dung from horses, pigs, chickens, and dogs that roamed freely through even the busiest markets. The River Thames, which Edmund had imagined as a grand and sparkling waterway, was a slow-moving channel of brown water that carried the refuse of the entire city toward the sea with agonizing slowness. Tanneries dumped their chemical runoff directly into the water. Butchers discarded unusable animal parts on the riverbanks, where they sat in the sun and attracted clouds of flies so thick they looked like moving shadows. Dyers poured vats of colored liquid into the current, creating streaks of unnatural blue and red that swirled through the brown like veins in diseased flesh. This was the London that Edmund Thorne entered on that June morning. This was the greatest city in England, the seat of royal power, the beating heart of commerce and culture. And it was drowning, slowly and steadily, in its own waste. The letter in Edmund's pocket was addressed to a man named Geoffrey Ashford, a spice merchant with a shop on Cheapside, one of the most important commercial streets in the city. Edmund's father had met Geoffrey years earlier at a wool fair in Canterbury, and had maintained a cautious friendship through occasional letters and small favors. When William Thorne decided it was time to send his son to London, Geoffrey was the natural choice. He was successful, he was well-connected, and he owed William a debt for a particularly favorable wool deal that had saved Geoffrey from a difficult financial year. Geoffrey Ashford's shop was easy to find. It was one of the larger establishments on Cheapside, with a wooden sign carved in the shape of a clove hanging above the door. The interior was narrow but deep, lined with shelves that held hundreds of small jars, pouches, and boxes. The air inside was thick with competing fragrances, cinnamon, clove, rosemary, lavender, dried rose petals, cardamom, and dozens of other scents that Edmund could not identify. After the assault of the streets, stepping into Geoffrey's shop felt like entering another world entirely. It was as if someone had taken a piece of a distant, beautiful garden and transplanted it into the middle of London's chaos. Geoffrey himself emerged from a back room, wiping his hands on a linen cloth. He was in his mid-50s, thin to the point of gauntness, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that were simultaneously warm and calculating. He looked at Edmund the way a horse trader looks at a new colt, assessing potential, noting strengths and weaknesses in a single glance. "You are William's boy," he said. It was not a question. Edmund nodded. Geoffrey studied him a moment longer, then smiled. "You look green. The city has already introduced itself, I see." Edmund managed a weak smile in return. "I was not expecting the streets to be quite so—" He searched for the right word. "Alive," Geoffrey finished for him. "Yes, London is very much alive. That is its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. Come, let me show you what we do here, and you will understand why a man who sells cloves and rosemary is one of the wealthiest merchants on this street." That first afternoon, Geoffrey Ashford gave Edmund a tour, not just of his shop, but of his philosophy. He explained that his business was built on a single, unassailable truth about human nature. People cannot change their world, but they will pay handsomely to pretend it is different. The wealthy citizens of London knew their city was filthy. They knew the streets were foul, the river was poisoned, and the air carried things that no person should breathe. But they also knew that cleaning the city was an impossible task. The infrastructure did not exist. The political will did not exist. The knowledge of how disease actually spread did not exist, and so they turned to the only solution available to them. They masked it. They covered the stench with something beautiful and called it good enough. Geoffrey showed Edmund the pomanders he crafted, small spherical containers filled with dried herbs and spices that wealthy men and women carried in their pockets or wore on chains around their necks. He showed him the sachets of lavender that ladies placed in their clothing chests. He showed him the rosewater that was sprinkled on dining tables before meals, and the bundles of dried rosemary that were hung in doorways to purify the air entering a home. Each product was a tiny fortress against the reality of London, a fragrant shield that allowed its owner to walk through the worst streets of the city and breathe nothing but cinnamon and clove. "It is not a luxury," Geoffrey told Edmund as they stood in the shop surrounded by hundreds of small aromatic bundles. "It is a necessity. In a city like this, the ability to control what you smell is the difference between sanity and madness. And that, my boy, is why people will always pay." Confira se já é inscrito neste canal. We tell stories here that most history channels will never touch. The raw, human, uncomfortable truths behind the dates and names you learned in school. If that is the kind of content that keeps you watching, then you belong here. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss a single story. Edmund Thorne threw himself into his apprenticeship with the intensity of someone trying to prove not just his worth, but his right to exist in a city that seemed determined to reject him. Within the first month, Geoffrey taught him to identify more than 40 different herbs and spices by scent alone. Edmund learned that clove had a sharp, almost aggressive warmth that could overpower nearly any unpleasant odor. He learned that lavender was softer, more subtle, better suited for personal use than for combating the heavy smells of the street. He learned that rosemary had a clean, almost medicinal quality that made people associate it with health, which was why so many physicians carried bundles of it when they visited patients. He learned that cinnamon, imported at enormous cost from traders who brought it across the Mediterranean from lands most Englishmen could not even name, was the most prized scent of all, not because it was the strongest, but because it was the rarest. To smell of cinnamon in 1346 London was to announce to the world that you had wealth, taste, and connections that stretched far beyond the grimy walls of the city. Geoffrey was a demanding master, but a fair one. He expected Edmund to work from dawn until well after dark, and he tolerated no laziness, no sloppiness, and no complaints. But he also fed Edmund well, gave him a clean place to sleep above the shop, and most importantly, he talked to him. Not as a master talks to an apprentice, but as a man talks to someone he is trying to shape into something greater. In the evenings, after the shop was closed and the day's accounts were settled, Geoffrey would pour 2 cups of ale and sit with Edmund by the fire, and he would talk about the world. He told Edmund about the trade routes that brought spices to England, the long and dangerous journeys from the markets of Constantinople and Alexandria, through the ports of Venice and Genoa, across the Alps and through France, and finally across the Channel to London. He explained how each step of the journey added cost, how each middleman took a percentage, and how by the time a handful of cloves reached Cheapside, it had been touched by dozens of hands and had traveled thousands of miles. He talked about the politics of trade, how wars and alliances between kingdoms could open or close routes overnight, how a single storm in the Mediterranean could delay a shipment by months and drive prices to extraordinary heights. And he talked about his customers. This was what fascinated Edmund most. Geoffrey knew every wealthy family in London, knew their habits and preferences, knew which ladies preferred rosewater and which preferred lavender, knew which aldermen carried pomanders openly as a sign of status, and which hid them in their sleeves because they considered it unmanly to admit they cared about smell. He knew which merchants were rising and which were falling, because a man's willingness to spend money on fragrance was, according to Geoffrey, one of the most reliable indicators of his financial health. A man who stops buying pomanders, Geoffrey once said with a knowing look, is a man who will soon stop paying his debts. But it was not only the wealthy who occupied Edmund's thoughts. As the weeks turned into months, Edmund began exploring London beyond Cheapside, beyond the relatively clean and well-maintained streets where the merchants and tradesmen did their business. He ventured into the poorer quarters, the cramped and lightless alleys near the river where the city's laborers, washerwomen, tanners, and dock workers lived. Here, the smell was not something that could be masked. It was the very substance of life. The houses were built so close together that the upper floors nearly touched, blocking out sunlight and trapping the humid, fetid air in permanent shadow. Gutters ran with waste that was never collected. Children played in mud that was more filth than earth, their bare feet splashing through things that would have made Edmund gag just weeks earlier. But these children did not gag. They did not even notice. This was all they had ever known. One afternoon, Edmund met a woman named Alice Barrow. She was perhaps 30, though the hard lines of her face made her look older. She worked as a laundress, spending her days bent over wooden tubs of water, scrubbing the linens of wealthy families who lived on the other side of the city. Her hands were raw and cracked, permanently reddened from the harsh lye soap she used. She lived in a single room with her 2 children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4, in a building so close to a tannery that the chemical smell had seeped into the very walls. Edmund had come to her neighborhood carrying a small bundle of dried lavender, leftovers from Geoffrey's shop that were too old to sell, but still carried their scent. He had started doing this regularly, bringing small gifts of fragrance to the people who could never afford to buy them. It was not charity in the traditional sense. It was something else, something Edmund was still trying to understand about himself. He wanted to share what he had learned about the power of scent, not as a commodity, but as a comfort. He handed the lavender bundle to Alice at her door. She took it and held it to her nose, and for a long moment she stood perfectly still, her eyes closed, her cracked lips slightly parted. When she opened her eyes, they were wet. She said, "This smells like the fields near my village. I have not smelled anything like this in years." Edmund did not know what to say. Alice looked at the lavender bundle in her hand, and then looked at him with an expression he would never forget. It was gratitude, yes, but it was also something deeper. It was the look of someone who had been reminded that beauty existed somewhere in the world, even if it had been absent from her own life for so long that she had almost forgotten. That night, lying on his cot above Geoffrey's shop, Edmund could not sleep. He kept thinking about Alice's face, about the tears that had formed so quickly and so naturally, as if the scent of lavender had unlocked something she had kept carefully sealed away. And he thought about Geoffrey's words from his first day. People do not pay to fix problems. They pay to forget them. The wealthy carried pomanders and sprinkled rosewater and lived inside fragrant bubbles that insulated them from the reality of their own city. The poor breathed the filth every moment of every day, and they had no choice, no escape, no lavender bundle to remind them that the world could smell of something other than decay. The perfume trade was not just a business. It was a mirror that reflected the most fundamental divide in English society, the divide between those who could afford to pretend and those who could not. As autumn settled over London in 1346, something changed in the atmosphere of the city, and Edmund did not mean the smell. There was a new tension, a subtle vibration of anxiety that seemed to hum beneath the surface of daily life. It started with the foreign traders. Geoffrey maintained relationships with merchants from Genoa, Venice, and the ports of southern France, men who arrived in London several times a year with their holds full of exotic goods. These were worldly men, seasoned travelers who had seen more of the earth than most Englishmen would see in 10 lifetimes. And in the autumn of 1346, they arrived with something new in their eyes. Fear. The first to speak of it openly was a Venetian named Marco, a regular supplier who brought Geoffrey his finest cinnamon and cardamom. Marco was normally a cheerful man, quick with a joke and even quicker with a negotiation. But when he arrived at Geoffrey's shop in late September, he was subdued. He sat by the fire with a cup of ale and spoke in a low voice, as if he were afraid the walls might hear him. "It started in the east," Marco said. "Far to the east. The traders coming through Constantinople brought word of cities emptied, of entire regions where no living soul remained. They say it moves like a shadow, following the trade routes, carried in ships and caravans. It has already reached the ports of Italy, Genoa, Venice. It is only a matter of time." Geoffrey listened without expression. Edmund, standing quietly in the corner, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "What is it?" Edmund asked. Marco looked at him with eyes that carried a weight Edmund had never seen in another human being. "They call it many things," Marco said. "The pestilence, the great mortality. It does not matter what you call it. What matters is that it is coming, and nothing can stop it." In the weeks that followed, more traders brought similar stories. Each account was worse than the last. Cities in Italy were being devastated. France was beginning to feel the effects. The Channel, that narrow strip of water that had protected England from so many continental troubles, suddenly seemed very thin indeed. Geoffrey responded to the news in a way that was entirely consistent with his character. He began stockpiling. He bought every available quantity of cloves, cinnamon, rosemary, and lavender he could find, paying premium prices to secure his supply before others realized what was happening. When Edmund questioned him about this, Geoffrey's response was measured and pragmatic. "If what Marco says is true," Geoffrey said, "then every person in this city will want what we sell. Not because it will save them, but because it will make them feel as though they are doing something. And when people are terrified, they will pay any price for the feeling that they are not helpless." Edmund stared at his master. "You do not believe the herbs will protect them?" Geoffrey met his gaze steadily. "I believe that people need hope, even if it comes in a sachet. I believe that the smell of lavender is better than the smell of fear. And I believe that a man who does not prepare for what is coming is a fool." It was the most honest thing Geoffrey had ever said to him, and it contained a contradiction that Edmund could not resolve. Geoffrey knew his products would not save anyone. He knew the pomanders and rosewater were not shields against whatever was coming. But he also knew that people would need them anyway, not for protection, but for comfort, for the illusion of control in a world that was about to spin wildly beyond anyone's ability to control it. Drop a comment right now with the words, "History repeats," if you believe that what happened in 1346 is still happening today, in different forms, all around us. Go ahead, type it. I want to see how many of you feel this the way I do. Edmund began to spend more time in the poorer quarters of the city. He brought larger bundles of herbs now, not just lavender, but rosemary and thyme, anything that Geoffrey could spare or that Edmund could purchase with his small apprentice's wages. He brought them to Alice Barrow and to dozens of other families who lived in the shadow of the tanneries and slaughterhouses. He did not tell them about the rumors from the continent. He did not want to spread panic among people who already had enough to fear in their daily lives. But he wanted to give them something, anything, that might help when the time came. Alice noticed the change in him. "You are frightened," she said one afternoon, as Edmund handed her a bundle of dried rosemary. She was perceptive, far more perceptive than her station in life might suggest. She had learned to read faces the way a sailor reads weather, because in her world, the ability to sense another person's mood could mean the difference between safety and danger. Edmund hesitated. Then he told her. He told her everything he had heard from Marco and the other traders. He told her about the sickness moving across Europe, about the cities falling silent, about the fear in the eyes of men who had seen the world and were now terrified of what was coming toward them. Alice listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that stopped Edmund cold. "We have always lived with sickness here," she said. "My children have been ill more times than I can count. The water makes them sick. The air makes them sick. The food, when we can afford it, is often spoiled. You speak of a great pestilence coming from across the sea, but for us the pestilence is already here. It has always been here. It is in the streets and the gutters and the walls of our homes. The only difference is that now, maybe, the rich will have to smell it too." Edmund had no answer for that, because she was right. The filth that the wealthy masked with pomanders and rosewater was not just an inconvenience. It was a sickness in itself, a slow and constant assault on the health of everyone who lived in it. The perfumed classes had built walls of fragrance between themselves and this reality, but the walls had never protected the people on the other side. The perfume trade had always been, at its core, a way for one half of the city to ignore the suffering of the other half. The winter of 1346 was cold and wet, and London drew inward like a fist. The streets, which were unbearable in summer, became a different kind of miserable in winter. Rivers of freezing mud that sucked at shoes and soaked through clothing. The Thames slowed but did not clean itself, and the cold preserved the waste rather than allowing it to decompose, creating a landscape of frozen filth that would wait patiently for spring to release its full power once again. Geoffrey Ashford's business had never been better. Word of the continental troubles had begun to spread beyond the merchant class, and ordinary citizens were now buying herbs and spices with a desperate urgency that bordered on frenzy. People who had never purchased a pomander in their lives were lining up at Geoffrey's shop, convinced that the right combination of cloves and rosemary could protect them from whatever was coming. Physicians recommended carrying fragrant herbs as a defense against bad air, which they believed was the primary cause of illness. The theory was ancient and deeply embedded in medical thinking. Disease came from miasma, from the foul vapors that rose from swamps, waste, and decay. If one could purify the air one breathed, one could avoid illness. It was logical, intuitive, and completely wrong. But in 1346, no one knew that, and so the demand for Geoffrey's products soared to heights he had never imagined. Edmund worked 18-hour days. He ground spices until his hands were stained and aching. He tied pomanders until his fingers were raw. He mixed rosewater by the barrel and bundled dried herbs by the hundred. The shop was never empty. There was always another customer, always another desperate face, always another hand reaching out with coins, willing to pay whatever Geoffrey asked. And Geoffrey asked a great deal. He had tripled his prices since the rumors began, and still people paid without complaint. Fear was the currency that made every other currency irrelevant. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Edmund sat by the fire with Geoffrey and said what had been building inside him for weeks. "We are taking their money for nothing," Edmund said. "The herbs will not protect them. You know this." Geoffrey did not respond immediately. He stared into the fire for a long time, the flames reflected in his sharp eyes. Then he spoke, and his voice was different from what Edmund had heard before. It was not the voice of a merchant. It was the voice of a man who had been thinking about the same question and had not found a comfortable answer. "What would you have me do, Edmund? Close the shop? Turn them away? Tell them that nothing can help them and send them into the streets to face their fear with no comfort at all?" Edmund opened his mouth and then closed it. Geoffrey continued, "I have sold fragrances for 30 years. I have never once claimed they could cure illness. I sell comfort. I sell the ability to breathe without gagging. I sell a moment of beauty in a world that offers very little of it. If people choose to believe that my lavender will save their lives, that is their belief, not my promise." Edmund shook his head. "But you are not correcting them. You are letting them believe." Geoffrey's expression hardened. "And every priest in every church in this city lets people believe that prayer alone will save them. Every physician lets people believe that bleeding and purging will cure what ails them. Every king lets his subjects believe that he has the power to protect them. The entire world runs on belief, Edmund. I am no different from any of them. I simply smell better. It was a deflection, and both of them knew it. But it contained enough truth to make Edmund fall silent. The months that followed proved to be the last months of normalcy that London would know for years. The Great Pestilence arrived in England in the summer of 1348, carried, it was believed, on ships from the continent. It would devastate the country in ways that no one in 1346 could have fully imagined, even those who had heard the worst rumors from the traders. But this story is not about the pestilence itself. This story is about what came before. About the year when England still had a choice, or at least the illusion of one. About the year when the stench of London was still the biggest problem most people could imagine, and the solution was still a handful of dried flowers in a silk pouch. Edmund Thorne left London in the spring of 1347. He did not leave because of fear, though fear was certainly part of it. He left because he had learned everything he needed to learn, not about spices and fragrances, but about people. He had learned that human beings, when faced with problems too large to solve, will almost always choose to cover them rather than confront them. He had learned that the distance between the scented handkerchief of a nobleman and the raw, cracked hands of a laundress was not just a distance of wealth, but a distance of accountability. The nobleman could afford to ignore the filth because he could afford to mask it. The laundress could not, and so she lived with it, breathed it, absorbed it into her body and the bodies of her children, and no one with the power to change things cared enough to try. Before he left, Edmund visited Alice Barrow one last time. He brought her the largest bundle of herbs he had ever assembled, enough to last months if she used them sparingly. She took the bundle and held it the way she had held that first small gift of lavender, pressed against her face, eyes closed, breathing deeply. When she opened her eyes, she did not cry this time. She smiled. "You are a good man, Edmund Thorne," she said. "Better than this city deserves." Edmund wanted to say something meaningful, something that would capture everything he felt about the injustice of her life and the inadequacy of his small gifts, but the words would not come. Instead, he simply said, "I hope it helps." Alice looked at him with that same deep, knowing expression she had worn when she told him that the pestilence had always been there for people like her. "It helps," she said. "Not because it changes anything, but because it reminds me that someone tried." Edmund carried those words with him back to Kent. He carried them through the years that followed, through the devastation that swept across England and changed everything forever. He carried them into his new life as an herbalist in his home village, where he used what he had learned not to mask problems, but to address them. He helped his neighbors understand the importance of clean water and proper disposal of waste. He taught them about herbs that could genuinely ease suffering, not as magical cures, but as practical remedies passed down through generations of knowledge. He never became wealthy. He never became famous. But he became something that Geoffrey Ashford, for all his success, never managed to be. He became someone who tried to change the world rather than perfume it. The paradox of 1346 was simple and devastating. England's greatest city was drowning in its own waste, and instead of cleaning it up, the people chose to cover it with the most beautiful scents money could buy. They carried pomanders of clove and cinnamon through streets that ran with filth. They sprinkled rosewater on tables, set in rooms where the air outside was thick enough to taste. They hung lavender in doorways as if fragrance alone could keep the darkness at bay. And when the darkness came anyway, as it always does, the pomanders and the rosewater and the lavender were powerless to stop it. The perfume trade of medieval England was not just a historical curiosity. It was a profound and uncomfortable metaphor for something that exists in every age, in every society, in every human heart. The desire to cover what is ugly rather than fix it. The willingness to invest enormous resources in the appearance of cleanliness, of order, of safety, while the foundations rot beneath our feet. London in 1346 did not fall because of filth alone. It fell because an entire civilization chose comfort over courage, chose the sweet smell of denial over the hard, unpleasant work of confronting the truth. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Because the pomanders may have changed shape over the centuries, but the instinct behind them has not changed at all. We are all, in our own ways, still carrying lavender through dirty streets. If you watched all the way to this point, it is because you truly enjoyed this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end, so I can get to know you and find out who really loves the stories here on this channel." If this story made you think, if it made you see the past and the present a little differently, then do me a favor. Hit that like button. It takes 1 second, and it helps more people discover stories like this one. Share this video with someone who loves history, someone who appreciates stories that go deeper than the surface. And if you are not yet subscribed, what are you waiting for? Every week, we bring you stories from the forgotten corners of the past, stories that reveal the human truths that textbooks leave out. Subscribe now, turn on that notification bell, and I will see you in the next one. Because history never really ends. It just waits for someone to tell it right.